And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Looking at tonight's weather, we can see this low center tracking northward, weakening, spreading some light snow up to the north there. And so conditions will improve down in the advisory warning areas here over the west central interior, and winds will diminish as well as any precipitation here across southern Alaska. Next system, though, starting to track northward here, but staying dry for the panhandle. Next front with wind and rain. Western Aleutians pushes to the east central Aleutians tomorrow. Front continues to weaken as it pulls out away from the main low, which is way back toward the Komodorsky Islands. Just some leftover scattered snow showers over the northern Bering Sea. This low now tracking out of the state up there into the Arctic Ocean. So dry western, central, northern interior to the Arctic coast. This low pulling up toward the Kenai Peninsula, bringing the wind and rain and snow into the area here with gale force winds, at least here along the North Gulf Coast, increasing wind and rain for the southeast coast. And then for our Thursday, a trough keeps it unsettled here for the North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle. This center develops along that front and tracks eastward. And looks like right now it'll stay south of Kodiak Island, possibly. Still could bring some light rain up into the area there, but nothing as far as any heavy winds go. And but gusty winds, rain and snow showers to the west central Aleutians. For the coastal water forecast there for the southeast coast on the south coast, we've got for tomorrow, east to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. East winds 30 knots for the central and north coast. Extreme north coast up here, gale warnings, east 45 knots with 21-foot seas there. Lynn Canal, north winds 20 knots, northeast 25 to 40 knot winds in the forecast for Stevens Passage. And Clarence Strait looking at a 20 knot wind from the southeast. And for Thursday, Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 to 35 knots. Southeast 20 knots for Stevens Passage, south winds 20 knots for Lynn Canal. Small craft advisories for the south coast on Thursday for south to southwest winds 25 knots, south to southeast winds 20 knots for the central coast, north coast, southeast 20 to 25 knots. Tomorrow for northern Cook Inlet, north winds increasing to 30 knots in the afternoon. Good gales here for southern Cook Inlet into Kamishak Bay, northeast at 40 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, northeast winds 35 knots. Storm warnings for the eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 50 knots, and gale warnings for Prince William Sound for east winds at 35 knots with seas up to 9 feet. And for the Thursday outlooks, Prince William Sound, small craft advisories, winds coming down to 25 knots from the southeast, seas subsiding to 6 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, east to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, northeast at 30 for the Barren Islands, and northeast winds 15 to 20 knots for Cook Inlet, north of 20 for Kamishak Bay. Kodiak Island, north winds 30 to 35 knots for the day on Wednesday, west-northwest winds at 15 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Excuse me. Bristol Bay, northwest winds at 15 knots with 3-foot seas. And for the Alaska Peninsula on Thursday, small craft advisories for 25 to 30 knot winds, east 20 knots for Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, north to northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And for Unalaska Island tomorrow, west-southwest winds 30 knots, but from Nikolsky to Adak, south to southeast winds at 40 knots. We've got gale warnings extending all the way out to the far western Aleutians there, out of the southeast and south at 40 to 45 knots. And for Thursday, southwest winds 40 to 50 knots for the western Aleutians. Central Aleutians, southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. And west-southwest winds 30 to 35 knots for the eastern Aleutians. For the southwest coast for Wednesday, not too bad wind-wise, south to southeast winds 15 knots. Southeast winds 10 to 15 knots for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, southwest at 20 for the Pribilofs, and west at 20 for St. Matthew Island, with 8 to 9 foot seas out here. And then on Thursday, east winds 35 knots, good for gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands, and northeast at 30 knots for St. Matthew Island, Yukon Delta Coast, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, all looking at a northeast wind at 20 knots. Kuskokwim Delta Coast, northeast at 15. Eastern Boulevard Sea Coast tomorrow, east-southeast winds 15 knots, northeast winds at 15 for the central coast, and the west side here, northeast winds at 10. Chuck CC, north winds at 10 knots. And then for Thursday, here for the Chuck CC, northeast winds at 20 knots, western Arctic coast and central Arctic coast, and the eastern Arctic coast, all looking at northeast winds at 15 or maybe up to 20 knots.